This, by definition, was a compromise bill. There are provisions in this bill and the basic funding within this bill that allows us to make sure that we continue on the progress in providing health insurance to all Americans, to make sure that we continue with our efforts to combat climate change.
Ah, there you go. The President Obama Legacy Tour is preparing for its 2015 debut with all the pundits wondering what will be his main focus. The consensus is climate change will be at the top of his agenda, one of the more contentious issues facing lawmakers, with consistent claims of fraud, even more claims of denial. When you take into effect, it was a 1,600-page, 16-pound, $1.1 trillion spending bill that the president recently signed, or will sign, or signed, if you will, called the Cromnibus Bill. The issue here at hand when it comes down to climate change and Mother Nature is the fact that there are many people who feel that climate change was promised to them by this president. He said this was going to be an absolute, he would take care of certain things. And with this new bill, it's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, here's just a few things that have suddenly walked into the realm of betrayal, if you will, by those who believe in the climate issue. The EPA, money, conservation stewardship program, all of these things. And now people are worried what's going to happen to all of this need to address climate change. All right. Let's welcome into MidPoint President and CEO of the Climate Reality Project, recognized as one of the top climate change attorneys in the world, former chair of the Obama Energy and Environment Team, Ken Berlin joins us today. Ken, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ken, when we look at that bill that I just pointed out, $1.1 trillion, but even you would have to admit there are people who believe in climate change, that it is happening, who have to feel somewhat betrayed by the president here, who did not do what he has promised to do, even though he's got a compromise down the road. But there's so many things missing here, especially cutting the EPA's budget by $60 million.
I think the EPA budget provisions are actually not going to affect the president's climate change agenda. They will have an impact on EPA, but the EPA itself had asked actually for less money than was approved by the Congress. And when they asked for that amount of funding, Gina McCarthy, the head of EPA, said that, in fact, the funding there was sufficient to enable them to complete their carbon rulemaking, which is the centerpiece of the Obama program right now, the rulemaking for existing power plants. So despite this budget, I would still expect that rulemaking will be completed on time and will be finalized around when it's supposed to be in June of 2015.
Okay, then let's look at a couple of other things here. The spending package forbids the EPA from regulating methane or methane emissions from animal livestock. The Conservation Stewardship Program funding has been cut significantly, and there's also blocking the State Department from paying the president's $3 billion pledge to the UN Climate Fund. Honestly, some of the folks I've talked to, they look at this, and you may be right about the EPA, but they feel as if the president pulled a bait and switch on them here.
Well, I think the president, felt that he had to do some compromise on this bill. And the provision in the bill that you mentioned, while not really great for climate change, are really ones that I think that we can live with for the moment. The methane provision, for example, basically prevents the government from passing mandatory methane emission provisions relating to livestock. However, there are in place already voluntary standards. They are being complied with by a lot of companies. So again, it's a setback to an extent to not being able to make it mandatory, but this is happening. And the opponents of this is a Pyrrhic victory when they do that, because we are going to have a certain amount of reductions of CO2 if we're going to deal with climate change. And if we don't get it from methane from livestock, we're going to have to get it from somewhere else. Methane from livestock was a convenient, economical way of doing that and would have an impact. So again, it's a setback, but it's not a major setback. And given all the other provisions of the bill, you can see why the president approved the bill despite that provision.
Ken, to this day, how much irritation does it give you when you hear people say, don't worry about climate change, it's a fraud?
Well, obviously, I find it very irritating. I mean, we just looked at a study in 2012 to 2013, 9,300 papers published by scientists around the world reviewed. These are all peer-reviewed studies. Every single one of those, with only one exception, found that climate change was a significant problem. So you're talking about a 99.999% agreement in the scientific community on this. Every study that's coming out shows that this is a critical issue. And the longer we wait to address it, the more expensive it's going to become, the harder it's going to be on business. Waiting actually hurts American business because American business needs time to plan. They need time to adapt to this. And if we give them the rules now and we know what they are, I think they will do better.
All right, now speaking of business here, the EPA, just right before Christmas here, a little gift for the coal industry, new regulation on coal ash from power plants. It's a $735 million a year price tag. That means that the coal industry has basically got to clean up its act. They say it's going to cost jobs. It's the wrong thing to do. But if we're going to look at this from both sides, isn't it fair to say that if you're going to create the mess, certainly we need the jobs, we need the power, but you've got to clean it up somewhere along the line instead of just letting this potentially walk into the waterways?
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, coal ash is obviously creating pollution problems. It makes sense to try and clean it up. And, you know, if you're an industry and you create a pollution problem, you should be responsible for cleaning it up.
When we get down to the bottom line of jobs, Ken, that's what always comes here. People say, you're costing us jobs. It's you, the climate change folks, who make us go through these rules and people can't work. But would it be fair to say that your message would be, well, if you don't do something now, you got to sacrifice a couple of jobs here early, because if you don't do it right now, the end result is going to be a lot more jobs and a lot more disaster.
Yes, that would certainly be our position, but we do think even more generally that transitioning to a clean energy economy, and that's what we're really talking about, will in fact create extremely large number of jobs. The estimated cost in some recent studies is that we will be spending, on a worldwide basis, about $1 trillion a year between now and 2050 to bring about that transition. That's all investment. That's all money being put into jobs, being put into businesses. Right now, the solar industry, for example, has more jobs than the coal industry does, even though it only has a fraction of the amount of energy production that the coal industry does. So there will be a transition, but on an overall basis, we will create, I think, far more jobs than we lose.
We are going to have to watch this, because as we go into the new year's, 2015, the president continues on his legacy of climate change, and then we're going to have to one of these days talk about what happens to the next person, male or female, who gets into office and what they're going to do about climate change. A discussion for another day. Ken Berlin, we're all out of time. Thank you so much for being here. Please, to you and your family, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and the same to you.
All right, take care. Speaking of change, whither goest Cuba next? And how much of what we hear about the island nation is true? We'll talk with someone who was on the ground in Cuba when the president announced his new plans for working with the communist nation. He can tell us what it's actually like firsthand. That's coming up right here on MidPoint, where we question everything.